CEO's son runs over gardener's daughter. Judge's ruling ignites nationwide protests. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. It was supposed to be just another rainy night. Miguel, a hard-working gardener, was returning home, eager to see his little girl, Luz, who always waited for him at the corner with a smile. But fate had a cruel twist waiting. A speeding car, driven by the son of one of the wealthiest men in town, shattered their world in an instant. The sound of screeching tires and a father owl, TM's desperate scream, pierced the night. Now, with his daughter fighting for her life and a powerful family determined to keep the truth hidden, Miguel stands at a crossroads. Will he accept the money and silence, or will he fight for justice, no matter the cost? What follows is a battle that will push a humble man to the edge, a courtroom showdown that will ignite an entire nation, and a final choice that no one sees coming. In a story of love, loss, and unimaginable strength, one father, TM's journey, will change the lives of countless others. But how far would you go to protect the ones you love? And when the world seems against you, can you still find it in your heart to forgive? The pitter-patter of rain echoed through the dimly lit streets of suburban Philadelphia. It was a dreary Friday evening in late October, the kind that made most people want to stay indoors. But for Miguel Ramirez, a 45-year-old gardener with weathered hands and a gentle smile, it was just another day of honest work coming to an end. As Miguel trudged along the sidewalk, his worn work boots splashing through puddles, his thoughts drifted to his daughter, Luz. At just 9 years old, she was the light of his life, a beacon of hope in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. He quickened his pace, eager to see her smiling face. Just a few blocks away, in a sprawling mansion on the hill, 19-year-old Ryan Henderson was getting ready for a night out. The son of tech mogul James Henderson, Ryan had never wanted for anything in his life. As he grabbed his keys and headed for the garage, his father's voice called out from the study. "Ryan, remember, be careful out there, the roads are slick." Ryan rolled his eyes. Yeah, Dad, I've got this." Back on the rain-soaked street, Miguel's heart swelled as he spotted a small figure in the distance. There, at the corner where their modest apartment building stood, was Luz. She wore a bright yellow raincoat and clutched a tiny umbrella decorated with cartoon characters. Her big brown eyes lit up as she saw her father approaching. "Papi!" she called out, waving excitedly. Miguel's exhaustion melted away. He quickened his pace, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Mi pequeña luz," he called back, using his favorite nickname for her, "my little light." As father and daughter moved towards each other, neither noticed the sleek sports car barreling down the wet road, its headlights cutting through the misty evening. Inside the car, Ryan was focused on his phone, thumbing through text messages from friends about their plans for the night. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the intensifying rain. Ryan glanced up briefly, then back down at his phone. It happened in an instant. A flash of yellow, the screech of tires on wet asphalt, a sickening thud. Miguel's world shattered as he watched his daughter's small body fly through the air, her umbrella spiraling away like a broken pinwheel. Time seemed to slow as Luz hit the pavement with a horrifying finality. "Luz!" Miguel's anguished scream tore through the night air. He ran towards her crumpled form, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Ryan's car skidded to a stop. For a moment, he sat frozen, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes wide with shock. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see Miguel cradling someone, in his arms. Panic seized Ryan. His breath came in short gasps. No, he muttered. Without thinking, he shifted the car into gear and sped away, tires squealing on the wet road. Miguel barely registered the sound of the fleeing car. His world had narrowed to the small, broken body in his arms. Luz's yellow raincoat was stained with growing patches of red. Her eyes, usually so full of life, stared blankly at the weeping sky. "Luz, mi amor, please," Miguel sobbed, rocking her gently. "Stay with me. Por favor, mi vida, stay with me." Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to emerge from their homes. Gasps and cries of shock filled the air. Someone was on the phone with 911, their voice shaking as they described the scene. As the wail of sirens grew in the distance, Miguel pressed his forehead to Luz's, his tears mingling with the rain on her pale face. "Don't leave me, mi pequeña Luz," he whispered. "You're all I have." The red and blue lights of the approaching ambulance cast an eerie glow over the tragic tableau. Paramedics rushed to Miguel's side, gently but firmly prying Luz from his arms. Their voices were calm but urgent as they worked to stabilize her. Miguel watched in numb disbelief as they loaded his daughter into the ambulance. A kind-faced EMT helped him inside, speaking words of reassurance that didn't quite register. As the ambulance doors closed and they sped towards the hospital, Miguel clutched Luz's small, limp hand in his own. He prayed as he had never prayed before, begging any higher power that might be listening to spare his little girl. The beeping of medical equipment and the urgent voices of the paramedics faded into the background as Miguel focused on Luz's face, willing her to open her eyes. "Stay strong, mi amor," he whispered. "Papi's here. I won't leave you." As the ambulance raced through the rain-slicked streets of Philadelphia, 2 lives hung in the balance. Luz's, as she fought for survival, and Miguel's, for he knew that if he lost her, he would lose himself as well. Meanwhile, in a luxurious bedroom across town, Ryan Henderson sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends wondering where he was, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. The image of that little yellow raincoat flying through the air played on repeat in his mind. What had he done? And what would happen now? As the night deepened and the rain continued to fall, the lives of the Ramirez and Henderson families had become irrevocably intertwined. In the hours and days to come, their paths would cross in ways none of them could have imagined, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge their beliefs, test their morals, and ultimately change their lives forever. The stage was set for a battle between power and justice, wealth and integrity. And at the center of it all, a father's love for his daughter would become a beacon of hope in a storm of corruption and deceit. The harsh fluorescent lights of Jefferson Hospital's emergency room cast long shadows across Miguel Ramirez's haggard face. He sat motionless in the waiting area, his work clothes still damp from the rain. His hands clasped so tightly, his knuckles had turned white. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second an eternity as he waited for news about Luz. Across town, in the opulent Henderson mansion, a very different scene was unfolding. Ryan paced his room, running his hands through his hair, his designer clothes rumpled and his eyes wild with panic. A soft knock at the door made him jump. "Ryan?" His father's voice was calm, controlled. "We need to talk." James Henderson entered the room, his face a mask of stern composure. Behind him followed Elena, Ryan's mother, her elegant features marred by worry. "What happened?" James asked, his tone leaving no room for lies. Ryan's voice cracked as he confessed, spilling out the details of the accident in a torrent of words. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. James, however, remained unnaturally calm. "All right," he said after a moment. "This is what we're going to do." Back at the hospital, a doctor finally approached Miguel. The words "severe head trauma" and "induced coma" pierced through his fog of despair. Luz was alive, but barely. The next 48 hours would be critical. Miguel was led to the pediatric ICU, where Luz lay small and fragile amidst a tangle of tubes and wires. The steady beep of monitors was the only sound in the room as Miguel sank into a chair beside her bed, taking her tiny hand in his. "I'm here, mi pequeña Luz," he whispered. "Papi's here." As dawn broke over Philadelphia, James Henderson's plan was already in motion. Money changed hands, evidence disappeared, and witnesses suddenly became unsure of what they'd seen. By the time the sun had fully risen, the police report of the hit and run had been buried under a mountain of bureaucracy. Elena watched her husband work with a growing sense of unease. "James," she said softly, "is this right? That poor child—" "This is about protecting our son," James cut her off, "and our family's reputation. You know what's at stake here. Elena fell silent, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Days passed. Luz remained in her coma, with Miguel a constant presence at her bedside. He spoke to her softly in Spanish, telling her stories of their homeland, praying for her to open her eyes. It was on the fourth day that James Henderson made his move. Miguel looked up from Luz's bedside to find the imposing figure of the CEO standing in the doorway. "Mr. Ramirez," James said, his voice smooth as silk, "I'm deeply sorry about what happened to your daughter. I'd like to help." Miguel's brow furrowed in confusion. "Help? How?" James produced a check, the amount making Miguel's eyes widen. "This should cover all of Luz's medical expenses, and then some. Enough to ensure a comfortable future for both of you." For a moment, hope flared in Miguel's chest. But then James continued, his tone hardening slightly. "All I ask in return is your silence. This unfortunate incident never happened. You never saw the driver. Do we understand each other?" The hope in Miguel's heart turned to ash. He looked from the check to Luz's pale face, torn between his desperate need for the money and the burning desire for justice. I need time to think," Miguel stammered. James nodded, placing the check on the bedside table. "Of course, take all the time you need. But remember, Mr. Ramirez, opportunities like this don't come along every day." As James left, Miguel stared at the check, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Could he put a price on justice for Luz? Could he live with himself if he took the money and stayed silent? Across the city, Ryan watched the sun set from his bedroom window, a glass of expensive scotch trembling in his hand. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him, made heavier by his father's calculated response. He took another swig of scotch, trying to drown the image of that little yellow raincoat that haunted his dreams. In her own wing of the mansion, Elena sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. The face that looked back at her seemed older, lined with the weight of the secret she now carried. She thought of the gardener's daughter, fighting for her life in a hospital bed, and felt something inside her begin to crack. As night fell over Philadelphia, 4 people lay awake, each grappling with their own moral dilemma. Miguel, torn between need and justice. Ryan, drowning in guilt and fear. James, calculating his next move to protect his empire. And Elena, feeling the first stirrings of rebellion against the life she'd accepted for so long. The seeds of conflict had been sown. In the days to come, they would grow into a storm that would shake the very foundations of their world, testing the limits of love, loyalty, and the human conscience. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. The true battle for justice was about to begin, and it would change all of their lives forever. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Luz's hospital room, casting a soft glow on Miguel's exhausted face. He hadn't left her side in days, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair, eating only when the kind nurses insisted. The check from James Henderson still lay on the bedside table, untouched but ever present, a constant reminder of the choice he faced. Miguel's calloused hands gently stroked Luz's arm as he spoke softly to her. "What should I do, mi amor? Tell me what's right." A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. A young woman with determination in her eyes and a stack of files under her arm entered the room. "Mr. Ramirez, I'm Samantha Reeves. I'm an attorney." She glanced at Luz's still form, her expression softening. "I heard about what happened to your daughter. I'd like to help." Miguel's brow furrowed. "Help? How?" Samantha pulled up a chair. "I believe we can build a case against the driver who did this. We can fight for justice for Luz." Miguel's heart raced. He glanced at the check on the table, then back at Samantha. "But I don't have money for a lawyer." Samantha's smile was kind but fierce. "Pro bono, Mr. Ramirez. No charge. Some things are more important than money." Across town, in the Henderson mansion, Ryan sat at the breakfast table, pushing his food around his plate. Dark circles underlined his bloodshot eyes. His mother, Elena, watched him with growing concern. James breezed into the room, impeccably dressed as always. "Everything's under control," he announced. "The Ramirez situation is being handled." Elena's fork clattered against her plate. "Handled? James, A little girl is in a coma, and she's getting the best care money can buy, James replied smoothly. Now, Ryan, pull yourself together. You have a future to think about. Ryan looked up, his eyes hollow. What about her future, Dad? The girl I hit. James's expression hardened. That's enough. We're not discussing this anymore. It's over. But it wasn't over. Not for Ryan, who excused himself and retreated to his room, the weight of guilt crushing him. Not for Elena, who watched her son go with a growing sense of unease. And certainly not for Miguel, who listened intently as Samantha laid out their options. The lawyer's words painted a picture of a difficult road ahead, a David and Goliath battle against a powerful family and a corrupt system. As Samantha spoke, Miguel's gaze drifted to Luz. He thought of her laughter, her dreams, her unwavering belief in goodness and justice. In that moment, he made his decision. Let's do it, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. For Luz, for justice. Samantha nodded, a glimmer of admiration in her eyes. It won't be easy, Mr. Ramirez. The Hendersons have money, power, influence. And we have the truth, Miguel replied, gently squeezing Luz's hand. As Samantha left to begin building their case, Miguel picked up the check from James Henderson. With a deep breath, he tore it in half, then quarters, letting the pieces fall into the trash. The battle lines were drawn. News of the lawsuit spread quickly. James Henderson's team of high-powered lawyers mobilized, preparing for war. The local media, always hungry for a David versus Goliath story, began to take notice. Ryan, watching the story unfold on TV, felt a mix of terror and relief. Part of him wanted to confess, to take responsibility for his actions, but his father's iron grip and the fear of consequences held him back. Eleanor, torn between loyalty to her family and her growing sense of right and wrong, began to secretly follow the case. She found herself drawn to Miguel's unwavering devotion to his daughter, his quiet strength in the face of overwhelming odds. As the days passed, Miguel's life became a whirlwind of hospital visits, meetings with Samantha, and dodging reporters. But every night, he returned to Luz's bedside, talking to her, reading her favorite stories, praying for her to wake up. The first court appearance loomed. Miguel, dressed in his best shirt, freshly pressed, stood before the courthouse, a sea of microphones and cameras before him. Samantha stood by his side, a steady presence in the storm. Mr. Ramirez, a reporter called out, do you really think you can win against the Hendersons? Miguel paused, looking at the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. This isn't about winning or losing. This is about doing what's right. For my daughter, for justice, for all the people who think they can't stand up to power. We may not have money or influence, but we have the truth. And in the end, I have to believe that's what matters most. His words, broadcast across local news channels, resonated with viewers. Social media exploded with support for the humble gardener taking on the corporate giant. Inside the courtroom, as the preliminary hearing began, Miguel felt the weight of what lay ahead. But as he thought of Luz, still fighting for her life in the hospital, he knew he had made the right choice. The battle for justice had begun, and there would be no turning back. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Miguel took the stand. Samantha's calm guidance had prepared him for this moment, but nothing could truly ready him for the sea of faces staring back at him. At the defense table, James Henderson sat impassively, flanked by a team of polished lawyers. Ryan, pale and fidgeting, sat behind them. Miguel's testimony was heartfelt and raw. He recounted the night of the accident, his voice breaking as he described Luz's small body flying through the air. The jury listened intently, many wiping away tears. But then came the cross-examination. The lead defense attorney, a shark in an expensive suit, approached with a predatory smile. Mr. Ramirez, he began smoothly, you claim to have seen the car that hit your daughter, yet in your initial statement to the police, you said you didn't see anything clearly. Which is it? Miguel hesitated, caught off guard. It happened so fast, but I remember... So you're changing your story? The lawyer pounced. Perhaps your memory has been influenced by certain parties interested in a large settlement? Samantha objected vehemently, but the seed of doubt had been planted. As Miguel stepped down, he could feel the tide of sympathy in the courtroom shifting. Outside, reporters swarmed around a surprise witness, Carlos Mendoza, Miguel's fellow gardener who had been walking home that night. "I saw it all," Carlos declared to the cameras, "but it wasn't the Henderson boy driving. It was a different car altogether." Miguel watched the interview on the courthouse steps, his heart sinking. He knew Carlos, considered him a friend. What was happening? Back inside, Carlos took the stand. Under oath, he described a completely different scenario from Miguel's account. The defense team looked triumphant. During a recess, Samantha pulled Miguel aside. "Something's not right," she whispered. "Carlos is lying, but why?" Miguel shook his head, bewildered and hurt. "I don't understand. He's my friend." As they strategized, neither noticed Elena Henderson slipping out of the courtroom, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. That evening, while James celebrated their courtroom victory with his legal team, Elena found herself driving to the hospital. She hesitated outside Lucy's room, watching Miguel reading softly to his comatose daughter. Taking a deep breath, she knocked gently. Miguel looked up, surprise and wariness crossing his face as he recognized her. "Mrs. Henderson?" he asked, standing protectively by Lucy's bed. Elena stepped in, her eyes filling with tears as she saw the little girl. "Mr. Ramirez, I need to tell you something." Meanwhile, across town, Ryan sat in a dimly lit bar, drowning his guilt in whiskey. A news report about the trial played on the TV above. As Carlos Mendoza's testimony was replayed, Ryan's fists clenched. "It's all lies," he muttered, drawing curious looks from nearby patrons. Back at the hospital, Elena's revelation left Miguel reeling. She explained how James had orchestrated the cover-up, including bribing Carlos to change his testimony. "I can't be part of this anymore," Elena said, her voice shaking. "What happened to your daughter? It's eating Ryan alive, and it's destroying our family." Miguel listened, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. Anger, vindication, and a glimmer of hope for justice warred within him. "Will you testify?" he asked finally. "Tell the court what you know." Elena hesitated, fear flashing across her face. I don't know if I can. James is powerful and ruthless when crossed." As if on cue, Elena's phone buzzed. A text from James. "Where are you? Come home now." The weight of her decision pressed down on her. Stay silent and protect her family, or speak out and risk everything. In that moment, a soft sound from the bed made them both turn. Lucy's fingers twitched, her eyelids fluttering. "Luce," Miguel whispered, hope surging in his chest. He pressed the call button for the nurse, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. As medical staff rushed in, Elena slipped out, her mind made up. She had a critical choice to make, one that would change the course of the trial and shake the foundations of her world. Outside the hospital, she made a call. "Samantha Reeves, this is Elena Henderson. We need to talk." The pieces on the board had shifted. As dawn broke over Philadelphia, the stage was set for a dramatic turn in the battle for justice. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, but at what cost to those involved? The next day in court promised to be explosive, with revelations that would shock the city and test the limits of loyalty, love, and the pursuit of justice. The courthouse steps were a sea of reporters and protesters as Miguel and Samantha arrived for what promised to be a pivotal day in the trial. Signs demanding justice for Luz mingled with others questioning Miguel's motives. The case had captured the city's attention, dividing public opinion and igniting heated debates about privilege, justice, and the power of wealth. Inside, the courtroom was packed. James Henderson sat at the defense table, his face a mask of cool confidence, but his eyes betrayed a hint of unease as they darted around the room, searching for Elena, who was conspicuously absent. As the judge called the court to order, Samantha stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls a surprise witness, Elena Henderson." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. James's composure cracked, his face paling as Elena walked in, her head held high despite her obvious nervousness. "Objection!" The defense team was on their feet instantly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We weren't notified." "Overruled," the judge decided after a moment's consideration. "I'll allow it. Mrs. Henderson, please take the stand." As Elena was sworn in, Ryan slumped in his seat, a mix of relief and terror washing over him. James's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. Elena's testimony was damning. In a clear, unwavering voice, she detailed James's efforts to cover up the accident, including the bribery of Carlos Mendoza. She described Ryan's torment and her own struggle with the weight of the secret. "I can't be silent anymore," she concluded, her eyes meeting Miguel's across the courtroom. "What happened to Luz Ramirez was a terrible accident, but the real crime has been the attempt to bury the truth." The courtroom erupted into chaos. James's lawyers huddled urgently, reporters rushed out to break the story, and the judge called for order. In the midst of the commotion, Ryan stood up. "I need to say something," he called out, his voice shaking but determined. Despite his lawyers' frantic attempts to silence him, Ryan made his way to the front of the courtroom. "I did it," he said, looking directly at Miguel. "I was driving the car that hit Luz. I was distracted, looking at my phone. It was an accident, but I'm so sorry. I should have come forward sooner." The admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Miguel, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events, found himself locking eyes with Ryan. In that moment, he saw not the privileged son of a wealthy man, but a scared, remorseful young person crushed by the weight of his actions. As Ryan was led away to be formally charged, James Henderson's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Reporters swarmed outside, the story of corporate cover-ups and family betrayal spreading like wildfire across social media and news outlets. Miguel, emerging from the courthouse with Samantha, was met with a barrage of questions, but his mind was elsewhere. "I need to get to the hospital," he said quietly. "Luz needs to know the truth has come out." At the hospital, Miguel found Luz's condition unchanged, but he felt a shift in the atmosphere. The burden of fighting against seemingly insurmountable odds had lifted, replaced by a cautious hope. "We did it, mi pequeña Luz," he whispered, holding her hand. "The truth is out. Now you just need to wake up and come back to me." As night fell over Philadelphia, the consequences of the day's revelations began to unfold. Eleanor, having broken her silence, faced an uncertain future. She checked into a hotel, unable to face returning to the Henderson mansion. Ryan, in police custody, felt a strange mix of fear and relief. The truth had finally come out, but the road ahead was daunting. James Henderson, his reputation in tatters, huddled with his crisis management team, desperately trying to salvage what he could of his empire. And in a quiet hospital room, Miguel Ramirez kept vigil by his daughter's bedside, daring to hope that justice might finally be within reach. But even as the truth had come to light, new challenges loomed on the horizon. The story had captured national attention, turning Miguel and Luz into symbols in a larger debate about justice and privilege in America. As Philadelphia buzzed with the day's events, Miguel realized that the fight was far from over. The courtroom battle might be won, but the war for true justice and for Luz's recovery was just beginning. The city held its breath, waiting to see what the coming days would bring. For Miguel, Elena, Ryan, and all those caught in the storm, life would never be the same again. As dawn broke over Philadelphia, the city was still reeling from the previous day's revelations. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse, the hospital, and the Henderson estate. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like "One Justice for Luz" and "Henderson Gate" trending nationwide. Miguel arrived at the hospital for his daily vigil at Luz's bedside, pushing through a crowd of reporters. As he entered Luz's room, he was startled to find Dr. Sarah Chen, Luz's neurologist, already there, a cautious smile on her face. "Mr. Ramirez," she said, "I have some news. We're seeing increased brain activity. It's subtle, but Luz might be waking up." Miguel's heart leapt. He rushed to Luz's side, taking her small hand in his. "Mi pequeña Luz," he whispered. "Can you hear me? It's Papi." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, Luz's fingers twitched in his hand. Across town, in a holding cell at the Philadelphia Police Department, Ryan Henderson sat with his head in his hands. The reality of his situation was sinking in. A guard approached, unlocking the cell door. "Henderson," he said gruffly, "your lawyer's here." But it wasn't a lawyer waiting for him in the visitation room. It was his mother, Eleanor. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but there was a resolve in her posture that Ryan had never seen before. "Mom," Ryan began, his voice cracking, "I'm so sorry. I've ruined everything." Elena reached across the table, taking her son's hands. "No, Ryan. You did the right thing, finally. I'm proud of you for telling the truth." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, they could see James Henderson arguing loudly with the desk sergeant, demanding to see his son. "I don't want to see him," Ryan said quietly. "Not yet." Elena nodded, understanding. "Ryan, there's something you need to know. Luz Ramirez, she might be waking up." The news hit Ryan like a physical blow. A mix of hope and terror washed over him. What would happen when Luz woke up? Would she remember the accident? Back at the hospital, Samantha arrived, having heard the news about Luz. She found Miguel in the hallway outside Luz's room, pacing nervously as doctors examined his daughter. "Miguel," Samantha said, placing a hand on his arm, "we need to talk about what happens next. If Luz wakes up, her testimony could change everything." Miguel nodded, his mind racing. The possibility of Luz waking up was all he had dreamed of for weeks, but now, faced with the reality, he realized it opened up a whole new set of challenges and decisions. As they talked, neither noticed Elena Henderson approaching hesitantly down the hall. When Miguel saw her, he stiffened, unsure of how to react to the woman who had both protected and then exposed the truth. "Mr. Ramirez," Eleanor said softly, "I know I have no right to be here, but I needed to know if Luz was really waking up." Before Miguel could respond, Dr. Chen emerged from Luz's room, her face serious. "Mr. Ramirez, Mrs. Henderson, Luz is showing signs of emerging from the coma, but there's something you need to know." The doctor's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Miguel felt his heart race, torn between hope and fear. "What is it?" he managed to ask. Dr. Chen took a deep breath. "Based on her brain activity and initial responses, we believe Luz may have some memory of the accident. But trauma like this, it can affect memory in unpredictable ways. We won't know for sure until she's fully conscious." The implications of this news hit everyone like a thunderbolt. If Luz remembered the accident, her testimony could be the final piece needed to ensure justice, but it also meant reliving the trauma and potentially facing a grueling legal battle. As the adults grappled with this new development, inside the room, Luz's eyelids began to flutter. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her eyes opened for the first time in weeks. The monitors in the room began to beep urgently. Dr. Chen rushed back in, followed closely by Miguel. "Luz?" Miguel called softly, hope and fear warring in his voice. "Mi amor, can you hear me?" Luz's eyes, unfocused at first, slowly turned towards the sound of her father's voice. Her lips moved, trying to form words. Outside in the hallway, Elena watched through the window, tears streaming down her face. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. "Ryan," she said when he answered, "Luz is awake, and she might remember everything." The news spread like wildfire. Within minutes, reporters outside the hospital were breaking the story. In law offices across the city, both the prosecution and defense teams scrambled to adjust their strategies. And in his opulent office, James Henderson received the news with a mix of dread and calculation. He knew that Luz's testimony could be the final nail in the coffin of his empire. Unless... James reached for his phone, his mind already formulating a desperate, dangerous plan. The stakes had never been higher, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect what remained of his world. As night fell over Philadelphia, the city held its breath. The awakening of Luz Ramirez had changed the game once again. The coming days would test the limits of love, justice, and the lengths to which people will go to protect themselves and those they care about. The stage was set for a final, climactic confrontation that would change lives forever. The Philadelphia County Courthouse was a fortress surrounded by a sea of protesters, supporters, and media. Inside, the tension was palpable as Judge Martha Stevenson called the court to order. This was it, the final day of a trial that had captivated the nation. Miguel sat at the prosecution table, his face a mask of determination. Beside him, Samantha shuffled through her notes one last time. Across the aisle, James Henderson's team of lawyers looked uncharacteristically nervous. In the gallery, Elena sat alone, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. Ryan, now out on bail, sat a few rows behind, his shoulders hunched under the weight of guilt and public scrutiny. "The prosecution calls Luz Ramirez to the stand," Samantha announced, her voice steady. A hush fell over the courtroom as Luz was wheeled in. Still weak from her long coma, she looked small and fragile in her wheelchair, but her eyes were clear and focused as she was sworn in. Samantha approached gently. "Luz, can you tell the court what you remember about the night of the accident?" Luz's voice was soft but unwavering. "I was waiting for my papa. It was raining. I saw headlights coming fast, too fast. I remember a face looking down at a phone. Then everything went black." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Ryan visibly flinched, his face ashen. "Can you identify the person you saw?" Samantha asked. Luz's eyes scanned the courtroom, finally settling on Ryan. "Him," she said, pointing. "He was driving the car." The defense team's cross-examination was brutal, trying to cast doubt on Luz's memory. But the little girl remained steadfast, her quiet certainty more powerful than any adult testimony. As Luz was wheeled back to Miguel, Judge Stevenson called for a brief recess before final arguments. In the hallway, Ryan approached Miguel and Luz, his lawyers trying desperately to hold him back. "Mr. Ramirez," Ryan said, his voice shaking, "Luz, I'm so sorry. What I did, there's no excuse. I'll accept whatever punishment the court decides." Miguel looked at Ryan, seeing not the privileged son of a millionaire, but a broken young man crushed by the weight of his actions. He felt the anger that had sustained him for so long begin to waver. Luz tugged on her father's sleeve. "Papa," she said softly, "he looks sad, like you did when Mama died. Can we forgive him?" Miguel's breath caught in his throat. He looked at his daughter, then back at Ryan. In that moment, he made a decision that would shock the courtroom and the nation. When court resumed, Judge Stevenson asked if anyone had any final statements before she rendered her verdict. To everyone's surprise, Miguel stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I have something to say." He walked to the front of the courtroom, facing the gallery. "When this trial began, all I wanted was justice. I was angry, hurt, and I wanted someone to pay for what happened to my daughter. But Luz, my little light, she reminded me of something important." Miguel took a deep breath. "Forgiveness. It's easy to seek vengeance. It's hard to forgive. But that's what Luz wants. And so, I forgive Ryan Henderson." The courtroom erupted in gasps and exclamations. Ryan looked up, tears streaming down his face. Miguel continued, "This doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences, but I ask the court to consider mercy alongside justice. Ryan made a terrible mistake, but he owned up to it in the end. That counts for something." As Miguel returned to his seat, the courtroom buzzed with shock and conflicting emotions. Judge Stevenson, visibly moved, called for order. "In light of Mr. Ramirez's extraordinary statement," she began, "I am prepared to render my verdict." The room held its collective breath as Judge Stevenson delivered her ruling. Ryan would face consequences: community service, a suspended sentence, and the revocation of his driver's license. But he would not go to prison. James Henderson, however, was not so lucky. The judge ordered a full investigation into his attempts to obstruct justice, with serious charges pending. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted once more. Reporters rushed out to break the news, Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags like loose lessons and radical forgiveness trending worldwide. Miguel hugged Luz close, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Eleanor approached them hesitantly. "Mr. Ramirez," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "what you did, thank you for showing us all what true strength looks like." Outside the courthouse, as Miguel wheeled Luz through the crowd, people reached out to touch them, to offer words of support and admiration. The story of a humble gardener teaching a lesson in forgiveness to a nation hungry for healing had struck a powerful chord. As they reached their car, Miguel looked back at the courthouse steps. He saw Ryan standing alone, looking lost and overwhelmed. Making a split-second decision, Miguel called out to him. "Ryan, would you like to join us for dinner?" The young man looked up, shock and gratitude warring on his face. He nodded, taking a tentative step towards them. As they drove away from the courthouse, leaving behind the media frenzy and the weight of the past months, Miguel realized that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a chance for healing, for growth, for building something new from the ashes of tragedy. The sun was setting over Philadelphia, casting a golden glow over the city. For the first time in months, Miguel felt hope, real, unshakable hope for the future. Whatever came next, they would face it together, guided by the light of forgiveness and the strength of the human spirit. As the sun rose over Philadelphia a week after the trial's conclusion, the city was still abuzz with discussions about forgiveness, justice, and second chances. The story of Miguel Ramirez and his daughter Luz had touched hearts across the nation, sparking conversations in homes, workplaces, and on social media about the power of compassion in the face of tragedy. Miguel woke early that morning, his heart light despite the challenges that still lay ahead. He made his way to Luz's room, where she was already awake, her bright eyes tracking him as he entered. "Good morning, mi pequeña Luz," he said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed. Luz smiled, reaching for her father's hand. "Papa, are we still having dinner with Ryan today?" Miguel nodded, marveling at his daughter's capacity for forgiveness. In the days following the trial, they had begun the slow, sometimes awkward process of building a relationship with Ryan. It wasn't easy, but Miguel knew it was necessary, not just for Ryan's redemption, but for their own healing. Across town, Ryan Henderson stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie nervously. He was starting his community service today, teaching a driver's education course focused on the dangers of distracted driving. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he was determined to use his experience to prevent others from making the same terrible mistake. As he headed out, he passed his father's study. James Henderson, once a titan of industry, now sat slumped over his desk, poring over legal documents. The investigation into his attempts to obstruct justice was in full swing, and the future of Henderson Enterprises hung in the balance. Elena knocked softly on the open door. "James," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "it's time for your meeting with the board." James looked up, the weight of his actions evident in the new lines on his face. "Eleanor, I'm sorry. For everything." She nodded, a small sad smile on her face. "I know. But it's not me you need to make amends with. It's them." She gestured towards the window, towards the city beyond. Meanwhile, at the local community center, Samantha Reeves stood before a packed room. Inspired by the Ramirez case, she had started a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal aid to underprivileged families. As she outlined their mission to potential volunteers and donors, she felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. As evening approached, Miguel and Luz arrived at a small, family-owned restaurant. Ryan was already there, fidgeting nervously with his napkin. As they sat down, an awkward silence fell over the table. Luz, with the straightforward honesty of a child, broke the tension. "Ryan, does your ouchie still hurt?" she asked, pointing to the fading scar on his forehead from the accident. Ryan blinked, surprised. Yeah, sometimes. But it's getting better." Luz nodded sagely. "Mine too," she said, patting her leg, still weak from the long coma. Papa says our ouchies remind us to be brave. Miguel felt his throat tighten with emotion. That's right, mi amor, he managed to say. As they shared a meal together, the conversation gradually became easier. They talked about Luz's progress in physical therapy, Ryan's community service, and Miguel's plans to start a small landscaping business. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of discomfort, but it was a start. As they were finishing their dessert, Miguel's phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline read, "Henderson Enterprises to establish scholarship fund for underprivileged youth." Ryan looked at the phone, then back at Miguel, a mix of surprise and hope on his face. Maybe Dad is trying to change too, he said softly. Miguel nodded, realizing that the ripples of forgiveness were spreading further than he could have imagined. As they left the restaurant, stepping out into the cool Philadelphia evening, Miguel felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as he looked at Luz, chatting animatedly with Ryan about her favorite books, he knew they were on the right path. The city lights twinkled around them, a reminder of the countless lives touched by their story. Miguel realized that their experience, painful as it had become a beacon of hope for others struggling with forgiveness and redemption. "Papa," Luz said, tugging on his hand, "can we get ice cream?" Miguel laughed, the sound carrying on the night air. "Of course, mi pequeña Luz. I think we all deserve a little sweetness." As they walked down the street, Miguel, Luz, and Ryan, an unlikely trio bound by tragedy and redeemed by forgiveness, Miguel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought about the power of choice, the strength found in vulnerability, and the healing that comes from choosing compassion over vengeance. Their story had captivated a nation, but for Miguel, the most important change was in their own hearts. As they turned the corner, heading towards the ice cream shop, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, guided by the light of forgiveness and the enduring power of the human spirit.
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.